meet the needs of our students, we're also meeting the economic needs of our state by continuing to construct buildings. And if I had as much money as we needed, then it'd be amazing the things that we could do. But we tend to, I think that when you see what you'll see from the information presented today, that we've done a lot of things lately. I think you'll be surprised by the progress that we've made and by the things that we've been able to accomplish. So often we come together and kind of operate in a vacuum, and we never kind of hear about what actually happens with the projects that we put together. You know, often we don't have time to go and look at any of the buildings and see the good work our universities are doing with the monies that we appropriate to them. So I think that with some of the information that we've been presented, that we'll be presented with today, you'll be proud to know that we are being good stewards of the state's dollars and making good recommendations for the system. With that, I'm going to ask Chris Kinsley to come up. He's the Director of Finance and Facilities, and start with our facility construction update.
Good afternoon, Chair Parker and other members of the board, President Ammons, and other university representatives. I'm very pleased today to present some information, as Governor Parker mentioned, regarding the completed projects. At the last meeting of the Facilities Committee, we received several questions about projects that have been completed for the system, and I wanted to make an attempt to close the loop with the board members in terms of we've spent a considerable amount of time looking at facilities budgets and plans, but we don't provide often information about projects that have been completed. In your packet, you will find a packet of supplemental materials that is this presentation, as well as in your packet are the 16 projects that have been completed for the university system in the last 6 months, July through December. And those are projects over $1 million, and we've added at a total construction cost of almost $400 million, and that's just in the last 6 months. And my hope is that this information, while very summary, is helpful to the committee, and we can certainly add additional statistics or information at the pleasure of the committee. I also wanted to get back to the committee on a request that had been made, I believe from Governor Parker, to talk a little bit about what the universities were doing with regards to green building initiatives. And a lot of times you'll see this, so we have collected information provided by the universities, and most things are in terms of something called LEED, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This is a program started by the U.S. Green Building Council in 2000, and it's a process whereby universities, but of course anyone who's in the building constructions, can certify that their building is a green building. There's 4 levels. There's a basic certification, silver, gold, and platinum. It's all based on points, and it has, the level that you achieve is based on the points for your building, which will be for different environmental factors such as the water treatment, the site design, innovation, if there's energy saving features and like. And just in this box, each university has chosen its own path on what to do. FSU and Gulf Coast have chosen the basic LEED certified as their standard. You can see some of the universities have chosen LEED silver. USF and FAU have chosen to build a LEED equivalent, so that they build the building to the LEED standard but aren't going through the formal certification process. FIU and New College are following an alternative green program. So that's just a little bit of an overview of what our universities are doing. I believe you'll hear more about this. This is an important initiative, part of Governor Christ's Energy and Climate Action Team, as well as several bills have been filed to direct state buildings to achieve a minimum level of green building. So this will be a matter that will come before the committee again, I'm certain. And I just wanted to highlight, I don't want to go through all 16 projects, but just highlight a few buildings that I thought were very unique. For Florida Atlantic, this is their College of Nursing. It was just completed in September. It's a LEED certified gold building. This was a Cortellis match facility, and it had a total construction cost of $16 million. And this was, I believe, their first LEED certified gold facility. The University of South Florida's Joint Military Leadership Center. This was funded from a variety of funding sources, showing creativity of our universities. They've used federal grant dollars, Cortellis, as well as some other private match funds to construct this facility, which is a general classroom building, and it has drought-resistant landscape, it's got energy-efficient glass, and has a centralized energy management system that helps reduce their energy cost. Another facility is Pugh Hall, just finished this December for University of Florida. From a variety of funding sources, this is a general classroom type facility with offices and labs, and Florida has been one of the leaders in the sustainability movement, so this is a representative type building. And lastly, New College has just completed a dorm project, 2 dorms, Y and Z, 207 beds. This is a dorm-funded program. So I wanted to emphasize to the committee that green building affects not just the PICO facilities, but the non-PICO, the bonded projects, which are also approved by this board. And that is basically this presentation. Governor Duncan.
Are we tracking at all what, if any, premium or return on investment for the additional costs for going lead or on these initiatives? Do we have any data on that?
We don't have any specific data on that. Some other systems have done some studies. What they have found, this program, as I said, did start in 2000. The first studies that came out in 2003-04 indicated construction cost was fairly high, between 7 to 10%. The later studies have indicated additional cost of 1 to 2% of construction costs. Some studies looking at energy savings feel this is, has a positive return on investment. We don't have that specific information for the state university system, but I believe the universities likely do, or at least their estimate, and we can begin to gather that information.
Well, I'm not trying to make a study out of it. I'm curious if that is part of the individual university's thought process, is looking at these decisions on the return on investment. Because I think you're exactly right from what we're seeing industry-wide, that additional front-end cost is being reduced significantly, and given the utility costs and other things, that payoff is coming quicker. And I just, would be curious as to make sure everyone's not thinking about it in tight times, because the perception is it's more expensive.
Right. My sense from talking to the facility planners is all the universities have embraced green buildings, and it's just the method, do they go through the costs? Some feel there's real value in the formal certification process. Others feel like they can do it internally to achieve the same results and save some cost. But that's a debate really going on at each university.
And I guess, I'm sorry, just one follow-up question. As it relates to, these are predominantly, if I get it, new buildings versus the renovating existing buildings. And there's a whole different set of standards for the renovations. But I know the state's been negotiating on performance contracting and some other things to front end some of that capital investment on those returns. And I'm curious, I know FSU's had some pretty good results doing that. If any of the others are, that'd be something I'd be interested in as well.
Is that
I guess if you know the answer, but if not, it would be something I think would be worth taking a look at. How are we dealing with retrofitting, because we have so much existing product as well?
The only one I can speak to in the works, and those energy savings contracts do fall under the board's debt guidelines, and I know that FAMU is in the process of putting together a proposal to do just that, one of those energy savings contracts, and we've been working with the staff of the university on that. So that may be a request that comes forward at a future board meeting. And I know there's a few other universities, you're correct, the FSU, University of Florida, I believe one other, who currently have energy savings contracts that I'm aware of, but they're existing contracts. So I don't know if there'll be anything coming forward to the board in the immediate, say, 6 months.
Any other questions? We had talked a little bit about how much it actually costs, I guess, for these certifications. Were you able to find out at all?
Yeah, the basic cost that is paid to that Green Building Council is going to be relatively small. It's going to be thousands of dollars just to submit the paperwork. The real cost, the 1 or 2% or the higher that you'll see in studies on this, go back to the hiring the professionals that have the proper certification to prepare the paperwork, to build things to the green standard. And that's where the additional costs come in. And what we've seen is 1 or 2% of the construction cost of the facility. So it would just be proportionate to the size of the facility. That's been our general experience. I believe there really is a learning curve as well. You know, for the first project that you submit, you know, staff, the architects, the contractor involved, it's a new process. Once they have some experience under their belt, I believe this certification is starting to become like the new standard. This is almost starting, an expectation is starting to be established. And hopefully, as with most technologies, the cost will come down the more people adopt it, if in fact this becomes more of a nationwide standard.
And I guess I have one other question, and following up on something that Governor Duncan mentioned. Given the dollars that we put in for renovation projects, can we tie the certification to the renovation based upon maybe the percentage of the building that we're renovating, or is this just for new construction?
I believe the standards right now, they have new construction standards. They're in the process of putting out standards for renovation. It's harder, the standards for the renovations, existing stock have been harder to establish, but the Green Building Council is in the process of doing that.
There's also an Energy Star rating that seems to apply to some more of the existing buildings as well. There's a couple different thresholds, but I think it generally does come down to the return on investment that you see with the reduced utility costs.
Any other questions? I guess one thing I'd like to mention is that, as you all are aware, we've been invited to join the governor this evening for a reception at the governor's mansion, and we all know how important this issue is to him. I would like that, you know, if in your conversations, if we would take a moment to say good things about the steps that our universities have taken in this direction, so he can be, I'm sure he's already aware of it, but we want to reinforce the fact, I guess I'm talking to you, but really want to look this way, as you're talking to the governor, to let him know that, just in case he didn't know it, to remind him of the fact that we have universities that have taken bold steps toward the whole idea of, I guess, embracing the concept of going green for Florida, and that as a board of governors, we wanted to make sure that we were also that our universities were following in that direction. We confirmed that, and we want to compliment him and compliment the universities and make sure the governor knows about it. So thank you very much. Chris, you want to go ahead and go to our next item, or go ahead and go to the amendment at the 08-09 fixed capital outlay legislative budget request.
Yes, if you would just bear with me for a second. And this, members, this is found on starts on page 4 of your committee materials packet. And this is a request to amend our 2008-09 fixed capital outlay legislative budget request. The first set of attachments is dealing with PICO. And attachment 1 lists out the recommended new PICO totals by university. The November Revenue Estimating Conference provided approximately $50 million more in PICO funding over the next 3 years for the state university system. And as staff, what we are recommending is that we apply that $50 million to projects that have already been approved by this committee and the board in September, so that we could accelerate those projects and complete them on a quicker time frame. So that's what we are recommending to the board. And just to highlight then the changes that have been adopted or recommended, that is found on the exhibits, and that is on page 29. And I can just quickly cover, I'll just name the projects that have been accelerated or provided additional funding. The University of Florida, the chemical biology building, which we had partially funded, it's still partially funded, but we've provided additional funding for that project to try to bring it closer to completion. The FSU Nursing Health Facility, again, another partially funded project that had been started last year, and we're, again, trying to bring that closer to completion. The USF Interdisciplinary Science Teaching and Research Facility, Previously, we had funded it over 3 years. We now are able to accelerate that and fund it over 2 years. FAU, their general classroom facility, had been funded over 2 years. We had $2 million in year 2. We've brought that forward into year 1, so that's a complete project now. For UCF and for FIU, the UCF Classroom Building 2 and FIU Student Academic Support Center, in September we had recommended those projects for planning money in year 3. At this point, we're recommending we move the planning money forward to year 2, and the construction dollars will start in year 3. So those have both been accelerated, and we are recommending we move the new college seawall infrastructure, this is a replacement project, forward to year 1 from year 3, because that's a sorely needed project. And those are the highlights of the list. There may be a few other minor changes, but those are the significant major changes for that $50 million of PICO. And then accordingly, attachment 2 is just the prioritization, which has not really changed. Were there any questions about how we've applied or our recommendations for applying the PICO dollars?
Any questions from members of the committee? Well, what we'll do is on tomorrow we'll be, I guess, submitting a motion to the full board regarding the proposed amendments to the LBR. And what we'll do is instead of passing that motion out of this committee at this time, we'll go ahead and wait until tomorrow to do that. So just note that we won't consider the motion at this time, but we'll consider the motion on tomorrow.
Okay. And may I go to the next
sorry,
item?
go ahead.
Thank you very much. And the next item, there's a packet of supplemental materials. It should be in your orange packet. These are substitute pages. These are additional pages for this item, for the fixed capital LBR. The first is attachment 4. That is the 5-year plan. As you know, what we just discussed was the 3-year plan. That's the amounts that have been allocated to the state university system. The 5-year plan is all university facilities, unconstrained by budget. So there's 305 facilities on that list. The list is both PICO and Cortellis. The priorities are established by found the BOG priorities. Basically, the top of the list reflects the 3-year list. Next is the Cortellis projects, then all other projects. So that's the 5-year list.
Do you have any questions regarding the 5-year list? Seeing none, which one move forward?
Okay. The next attachment is in the same packet, the supplemental materials packet. This is the Alec P. Cortellis Facilities Challenge Grant Enhancement Program. We have received a request from the universities. This is the one-for-one match program that the state has established. We have a request for over $68 million in funding for the Cortellis program. That compares to roughly $42 million that we had last year. So once again, the source of those dollars has historically been either non-recurring general revenue or lottery. So once again, given the difficult economic times we face, we will have to probably strive very hard to assure we receive full funding for all these projects. I do have one technical change that's been requested on behalf of Florida Gulf Coast. And I'm sorry, this is page 17A of your packet. It's the very last item. It's the FGCU Environmental Demonstration Lab. From the material submitted, it indicates here the university received $500,000 of match. It's actually $1 million, and I would ask that the committee accept that technical amendment to increase the match to $1 million. It's a $2 million project, not a $1 million project. That was just a technical error.
Which one is that, Chris?
That's the very last item on the list, the Environmental Demonstration Lab for Gulf Coast. That increases the total Cortellis request to $68.8 million.
Any questions at this time? No?
And I will just, if it's with the committee as well, the other attachments, attachment 6, attachment 7, are both what we historically call back-of-the-bill items. These are university approval to acquire projects, debt-funded projects. The first list lists only athletic facilities, because for all other facilities that are to be paid from debt, the legislature has delegated that authority to the Board of Governors in 10-1062. So we no longer submit a list of debt-funded projects to the legislature in accordance with 10-1062. The other projects which may require plant operations and maintenance, and this is more of a notification. If these projects are requested and if they require maintenance, we have to just put it in there for notice purposes for statutory reasons. And those are the other attachments in the LBR, and that's all I have for the LBR amendments.
Any members of the committee have any questions on any of the items or information that Chris has presented regarding the amendment to the LBR? If not, as I mentioned earlier, what we'll do is we'll have one amendment that we propose to the full board on tomorrow regarding, or one motion, regarding these amendments, and this won't consider the amendment at this, consider the motion at this time today. At this time, what we're going to do is, when you hear the presentation on item number 8, which is the Capital Improvement Fee Trust Fund, I think staff has provided some additional information to be considered by the committee. Is that correct, Chris? That's
exactly right. If you will turn again to the supplemental materials packet, there's a replacement page 63, 64. There's actually not a 64. I consolidated it. 65 and 66. I'd like to go over those, if I may. When we put the package together, this was intended as an informational item, but based on the latest bond capacity information I've received, I would like to make this an action item. And let me first talk for the committee, describe briefly the Capital Improvement Fee Trust Fund and the nature of how it works. For each credit hour, the students are assessed on an FTE basis $2.44 per credit hour capital improvement fee, $2.32 building fee. This program has been, those fees have been the same since 1988. The fee is collected by the universities, it's remitted centrally, and every 2, 3, 4 years, the funds build up, and our capacity builds up, and we do a debt issuance. Those funds then are allocated to universities, and it's proportionate to their contributions to the fund. The actual projections that drive their allocation are based on 2 years of collection history and 2 years of projected history based on their FTE projections. And so then going to, and the last issuance was in 2006, we did an allocation of $103 million. $43 million was from cash that had built up, and $61 million was from bond proceeds. And those are approximate numbers. If we look at page 65, we can see we start with our unobligated capital improvement fee amount of $41 million. That's projected at June 30th of this year, 08. We have our fee collections, the estimated interest earnings. We have our bond capacity. That's the line, the $104 million, the net bond proceeds available for deposit, and then less the total debt service payments existing, less child care centers also come from this trust fund. We come to the $160 million that I would propose. And then the page that I think will be of most interest to universities, page 66, indicates of the allocation for the $160 million. Each university starts with a balance. It could be a positive or negative balance. In this case, it's all positive. Of their entitlement balance, this is the balance that was a carry forward from the last issue, and then the projected amount based, as I said, on the projection. So this is historically how the process has worked, and if approved today by our board, approved tomorrow by the full board, this would become part of our legislative agenda package, our LBR package. The legislature would approve this as a budget line. The universities would develop projects in consultation with the student governments, because these are student fees, and give a list of projects. The trustees then would approve the projects and submit it to the Board of Governors August 1. We would then take that list forward to this committee at its next September meeting, and I would hope that we could issue projects sometime in late fall. So this is an improvement over what's in the packet, indicating we could issue in 09-10. It brings it forward a good 6 months if all goes as planned. So is there questions on this pack? Because I know this is all new material to the committee.
Any questions from members of the committee? I guess my only comment to you, Chris, is thank you. Thank you for actually watching out and looking out and seeing that this was a good time to actually pull some money from the trust fund. I think that we thought that we would just be receiving some information today, but I certainly want to commend you for doing your job, and doing a very good job at your job, and finding money at a time when certainly each university can benefit. And I know the students will be happy, and the student body presidents in particular, they'll be able to bring this to their universities during their administration. So just kudos to you for having a watchful eye.
Well, thank you. And we will be providing, I don't know if this is good news or bad news, we'll be providing the typical debt packages that come forward from the universities that we approve as a board for bonds, for parking and housing and the like. Our board, as a state university system, will approve these as state university system bonds. So we'll have a full board resolution, pro formas, and all the other typical bond issuance type information, but that will come at a latter meeting, and I'll work closely with Division of Bond Finance in developing that.
Dr. Rosenberg?
Chris, is there any way the process could be expedited so that we in fact could make a decision once there's legislative approval earlier than, I think you said, the fall?
Well, I believe, just thinking off the top of my head, we have a August board meeting. Is that not correct?
Yes.
We could, if we had a facilities committee meeting in August, we could approve the list of projects. We could aim for a target date, of an August approval. We would likely need the universities to submit the information earlier than August 1 to do that. And we could, the legislative authorization would not be effective to July 1. So I'm thinking we could
expect that the legislative authorization will happen. So then the issue is how, if at all, could we expedite the process, which would be helpful, I would assume, to the Florida economy.
Mm-hmm.
The student governments are going to need to be involved in this as soon as possible, because often at most on campuses, they're the ones that are going to select the projects, bring them to the president, and they'll work out the details in consultation. So I think Ryan needs to be approached and told about this and mobilize his forces.
So, Madam Chair, might we consider a possibility of moving this faster?
Yes, in fact, I like the way you're thinking, Mr. Chancellor. I think that why don't we anticipate that we're not going to have any problems during the legislative session, and why don't we speak with our student member and encourage him to go ahead and get the university presidents, or university student body presidents, started thinking in that direction. Okay. So that what about as soon as it becomes effective, which he says July 1?
Yeah, I would imagine typically the legislative appropriation would be effective July 1, and then we would also, what I will do, Chancellor and Madam Chair, I will look at the time frame and see how rapidly, from our standpoint, we could accelerate. Looking at our board calendar, I also will need to consult and look at the cabinet calendar. Since these are state of Florida bonds, cabinet as a pro forma will also approve these. So I just have to look at the timeline, and I don't believe there will be any barriers to this issuance, but just kind of step by step through it and see how rapidly we could accelerate it from a Tallahassee standpoint, and then work with our student board member and the university staff to see how much time they need and match that up. And yes, that would be a wonderful idea to accelerate this even further would be great.
Yeah, I'm sure that those university student body presidents have some idea already how they probably want to spend this money, so it won't take them that long. And I think that they're doing their work in anticipation of what was going to happen on July 1. Any guidance you can give our student members so we can go ahead and speak with the other members of FSA would be appreciated. I think it is a very good idea, Mr. Chancellor, for us to go ahead and get the ball rolling.
Okay. Very good.
Again, I guess that's indicated this will require a motion that we will go ahead and take up before the full board on tomorrow. Okay. The next item on our agenda, I think, is dealing with the actual changes that we need to make in regulations. Is that correct, question? Or public
Yes,
notice
that's
of
correct.
amendment of our BOG facility-related regulations. You want to go ahead and take that item up? And would you first explain to the committee the way we talked about how we're going to address the issue for you?
Yes, I'd be very glad to do that, just for the members of the committee and for the members of the audience. The Board of Governors, as you know, has a whole series of regulations. Most of our existing regulations were adopted from old Board of Regents rules at the very first board meeting, which I believe was in 2003. The board adopted the rules as regulations, including the existing facility regulations, but made no changes to them other than to adopt them. At this point, what we're doing as staff and as a board is looking at our existing regulations and bringing them current. There's, in many cases, particularly with these facility regulations, they have references to statutes that have since been moved in that school code rewrite. There's references to Board of Regents. There's references to practices that are not current practice of the Board of Governors state university system, but reflect rather old historical practices, regulations of the Board of Regents. So the intent generally here is to bring our regulations, conform them to current practice, and bring them in line with current law in as much as possible. And today's is the first discussion of this in the Facilities Committee, so this is only notice of intent to amend. We can take technical comments from the public, or any comments from the public, the universities, and go through the process. And then the intent, if approved for notice, would be to bring these back to this committee in March for formal amendment. And then I have one that's a repeal, which I will discuss. So that's why we're doing this and why we're taking it to this committee. We believe these are all facility related, and the proper home is the facility committee before it goes to the full board. And with the pleasure of the committee that I go through these briefly, one by one, explaining what each is, or how would you like me to run through these, Governor Parker?
I guess my preference would be that I know we'd indicate that some of them are mere technical changes and some of them seem to have a little, I guess, more significant change in the way that the way that the Board of Regents previously did business. So why don't you go through each of them, but just noting that the ones that are a little bit more significant changes and those are just simple, basically almost typographical or scrivener or clerical type changes in the actual regulation.
Okay, very good, and please stop me for questions at any point in time. The first, this starts on page 31 of your packet, public notice of intent to amend Board of Governors Regulation 9.004 for raising of buildings. This is a conforming change. The existing has no reference to the Board of Trustees. Instead of saying each university has authority to raise buildings, we put University Board of Trustees. We also add some language to reflect current practice and this is required in the funding statute, the 1013 funding statute, that there be an educational plant survey recommendation prior to demolition. That's been the practice of the state university system, but it was not in regulation. So here we're adopting that into regulation, and I would construe this as a conforming change. The next one is public notice of intent to amend Board of Governors Regulation 9.005 for naming of buildings. This provides, the existing regulation is very brief. If you look on page 34, It's a president may recommend for consideration of the board. Again, what we are doing here is delegating the naming authority from the Board of Governors to the Board of Trustees, providing very broad policy guidance to the trustees to adopt in their own regulations, also providing basically an exception clause that if within these very broad, responsible constraints, a university feels like they have a very valid exception, that they can bring that to the board for an exceptional approval. But typically, with adoption of this regulation, I would not anticipate that the board would see a laundry list of namings for approval. They're delegating the broad authority, and it would be a rare exception to have a naming come forward to this board. So that is a fairly significant change. Prior to this regulation, particularly for living persons, required legislative approval, and that's no longer required. And this reflects that the board now has that authority and is delegating that to the trustees. I will then go, the next series of 10 regulations, I will just name and highlight, as you asked Governor Parker, the material changes. These are all, starting with 14002 on page 35, all relate to construction procurement, selection of design professionals, the fee curve for professionals, and the like. And I will just cover those very briefly. The first one is the definition section. 14004 is the announcement and qualification procedures. And again, no significant changes there. They're conforming. 14005, certification and competitive selection of architects engineering. There we do have a change in regulation, although not in practice. On page 41, section 1 and 1A, existing regulations specify that there needs to be a selection committee, and it needs to have at least 3, but no more than 5 members. 3 out of the 5 members must be members of the facilities or physical plant office. This is a practice some universities follow and some do not. And from extensive conversations with the universities on this, we believe we have arrived at what is a reasonable regulation of 1A, of saying the committee must consist of at least 3 facilities professionals. However, they don't all have to come from the university facilities office, so that there can be a good mix of people on the committee, and there can also be technical expertise. I know particularly, and the Chancellor may wish to speak to this, if it's a facility for a particular discipline, the dean or director of that program may very well want to appoint somebody to sit on the committee and make sure that the end user's needs are representative, and they are able to pick an architect or engineer who they feel will best meet their facilities needs. So I believe the universities are following different practices on selection that they all feel very good with. This regulation will not require any university to change their current practice, but kind of puts in regulation what the good practice should be. So that's a change in that section. Is there any questions? I'll move to the next one. Board of Governors Regulation 14007, competitive negotiation. On page 44, I would like to point out 1A. There used to be a fee curve, a state university system fee curve for architects and engineers. That has not been updated in many, many years. The staff that created that curve no longer exists. The universities typically have been using the Department of Management Services approved fee curve as a guideline. And that's what we are recommending. The university is allowed to go higher than the curve, and it may negotiate lower, which would be in the best interest of cost savings, which some universities are aggressively doing. But we're just making it very clear there no longer is a state university system fee curve, but we are using the state's fee curve. So that's the change on that one. 14018, contracting authority. Again, this is a technical change. 14020, university supervision for construction contracts. There's not any, those are all technical changes. 14021, procedures for construction contract bidding and award. I would say there's no large changes there. 14022, disqualification procedures. I don't think there's anything, there's two changes there. They're technical, but I think should be pointed out. This is page 54. Throughout this document, we've struck the references to the MBE programs. The board had entered into a settlement to not have an MBE program anymore, or their university systems where we designate points for MBE programs. So those references have been removed from our regulation on advice of counsel. Also, we've removed our references to Chapter 120, Florida statutes, which is the administrative hearing procedure, inasmuch as we're adopting board regulation and not Florida administrative code. We don't fall under the Chapter 120 hearing process, which is for Florida administrative code for rules, and we're adopting regulations. So we have an alternative procedure. So there's a brief reference to that here, and in the next section, 14023, again, we taught there's a quasi-judicial hearing. We would basically go up through a circuit of court level appeal as opposed to division of administrative hearings. Formal bid protests that go all the way to the level of a hearing are few and far in between. This should not be a major operational change to the universities, but what it means is for the vendors who participate in bids, they will know what the process is if they do file a protest, if they feel there is any, because this is part of the free and competitive bidding of these construction contracts. And 14025, action required prior to capital outlay appropriation. Again, this is a technical change, and that's all the ones that are recommended for amendment, and then I have one repeal, but I'll pause a second.
And I assume we'll get rid of the bog regulation XXX on page 59.
That is,
either that or it'll wake this audience up.
Yes, that has to be, thank you, Dr. Chase. We are looking at developing a regulation for the educational plant survey. That's currently laid out in statute. We are contemplating developing regulations for the educational survey process. At this point, I don't see that in the immediate future, so we'll probably put the statute reference there or make some other modification. Thank you.
Before we move on, Chris, I want to go back to I guess something that came to mind as you discussed page 54 and the deletion of the MBE plan information. I know that we made several changes within the state in the last 8 to 10 years regarding minority participation in programs. And I guess I'm thinking out loud. I want to confirm this with you. I know that we have an Office of Supplier Diversity for the state of Florida that actually looks at our state agencies and encourages their participation or inclusion of minority contractors in different facets or in different areas. So my assumption is that the state university system is not regulated, governed, or included in that process by the Office of Supplier Diversity. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct. My understanding is the universities report MBE information but are not governed by the MBE statutes or rules on MBE.
So, and pardon my ignorance, but then we're reporting that information to the Office of Supplier Diversity or someplace else?
I believe it gets reported to the Office of Supplier Diversity ultimately. I'm not sure if it doesn't come to the Board of Governors. There may be some intermediate stop where it goes before it gets to Office of Supplier Diversity. And I don't exactly know the answer to that question. I did at one time, but I would hate to say that's the current practice. That was the practice a couple years ago. I will have to find that out.
Yeah, would you look into that for me?
Yes.
Also, I'd be interested in getting some data or information about what's actually happening out there. So, and it may be that we can actually get the information from what's submitted by the university to the Office of Supplier Diversity. But I am interested as a committee, particularly since we're officially taking out information from our regulations. I'm interested in the university's actual inclusion of minority and minority contractors in their construction projects particularly. If you could look into that for me.
I will certainly do that.
Okay.
Governor McDevitt.
Governor McDevitt.
Chris, I just wanted you to clarify, these regulations have all been reviewed by the universities and there's not any issues?
We have worked very closely with the universities, starting with the mid-level managers who work with these on a daily basis up through the presidential level, the CAFA, the Council of Administrative and Finance Vice Presidents. That may not be exactly right. And they've vetted these. We've received their feedback. As much as possible, we have adopted these to address all the university concerns that have been raised. When dealing, of course, with 11 institutions, it's hard to find the exact wording that pleases all 11 institutions. But at this point, I don't believe there's any specific, other than a technical change, such as Dr. Chase pointed out, where there may be some error in the actual regulations, that a university would say, this change is going to just change the way we do business. This is going to have a negative impact on our current operating practice. Some universities, I'll be very candid, would like these regulations to be broader. As you can see, they're very prescriptive in some cases, but I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, would have been fine.
Thank you.
But it would not have maybe expressed it totally as everyone's not just thrilled.
Yes, but everybody's not thrilled. Would have been fine.
They accept that they have to have a certain level of prescriptive regulations, I believe.
Thank you very much. Go ahead and move to the other item that you suggested that we repeal.
Yes, I have one for repeal. This is 10009, smoking in public buildings, 61. We previously had a regulation banning smoking in public buildings. Since this regulation, there's been a constitutional amendment that does the same thing. So we no longer need a regulation since the Constitution has an even stronger ban than what's in our current regulation, the Florida Constitution. And that is the entire set of regulations. I'm very glad to say we do have a few other regulations that will be going to the committee. There's a set of master planning regulations that Steve Pfeiffer had briefly mentioned at the last committee meeting. There's a work group that's developing, again, conforming regulations to the master planning process, and there's a lease regulation that will come forward to this committee. And those are the general regulations. Then with that, all existing facilities regulations will have been brought current. And then, of course, if the board saw a need to adopt further regulations, that could be directed to staff, and we would proceed with regulation development.
So then, just go through the process for me so I can make sure I understand that. It's that I know that we will approve, I guess, this public reading that we've done in committee. We'll approve it in full board tomorrow. And then what happens next? Is it
What happens next is these will be posted on our website, and there's a process via our web where anyone can comment on these regulations, and from the public, from the universities, from any interested party. As staff, we will look at the comments, and certainly if it's a technical correction or grammatical, we will make those changes. If there's any substantive issues that we feel need to be brought forward, we will bring all issues forward to the board to this committee at its March meeting, and I'll have, for the record, I'll have every change documented. I will not go through every comma, dot, and tittle, but if there's significant changes, those will be discussed to the board. At that point in time, the committee can decide to recommend adoption as is, or they can amend at that point, or they can ask staff to go back and continue the notice process, to continue regulation development until they feel comfortable making a recommendation to the full board. Ultimately, if approved in March, we can make them effective immediately, or if some are of a fiscal nature, they could be effective July 1 of 08, if they have a periodicity to them, if that's a word.
okay? So then, I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
No, wait a minute. I just want to thank Chris and Nancy gee, they have worked hours on this, and thank you very much. It's been, I know, a work of pleasure.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hopefully, developing the PICO list is very interesting. I can't say the same for the regulation development process.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think that our next item is that, if you all recall, some time ago, we took on Big Facilities Initiative, and where we actually brought all representatives from each of the universities together to come and actually talk about things that we can do to change the system. And so often when these groups come together, it seems that the ideas kind of get placed in a report and stuck on a shelf. So we've tried to do what we can to make sure that the initiatives that were presented by the committee, it was led by Bill Merck out of UCF, and we had representatives, as I said, from each of the universities participate. We wanted to make sure that those good ideas remain active and we're moving forward. So what we've done is we've asked Chris to kind of update us on what's actually happening with the facilities task force, what initiatives have we made, and maybe some other things we may be able to do to push the initiatives forward. So Chris, with that.
Yeah, thank you for that very good introduction. I did want to report back to the committee. The facilities initiative is still moving forward. We are still working with the university work groups on various aspects of the initiative. I hope to have a full report in March of recommendations that have been run from the work groups that have been vetted with the universities. I wanted to particularly just highlight some of the work that's been done by the work groups that I thought helped address some of the questions that were raised in committee again in September. And you can see sort of theme bookending this committee. The comments we received back from the committee members, the board members, the universities are very, very essential and critical to us as staff. And we take each comment very seriously, and it very much influences what is put forward as a recommendation by staff. And I know it may not always seem that way to board members when you come for it may seem like a very long hour and a half, but that hour and a half is very essential to the state university system, the facilities, and also staff, because we can use that then to develop the policies of what are the priorities, how should we make our recommendations that are on that PICO list, which are essential. So this is what I thought was some very, hopefully helpful information. First, there's two things that drive how we calculate space need. One is what's called the factors. The factors are basically something they've been developed. The current factors have been developed, I think, over 10 years ago, and they say for every given FTE, you need so much classroom space, office, gym, study, research lab. It's done by discipline, and there's a formula that calculates the factors. The work group has been working on seeing if our factors are reasonable and do they reflect the need at each university. We are not finished with that yet, but generally speaking, the work group feels the factors are reasonable and do a reasonable job of showing need. And I'll get into that a little bit more. The other is you take the factor times the projected FTE for the given university, and that shows you what the relative need is of each university. And for those members who have been with our board for some time, these charts will look familiar. We've done it that way for a long time. This is just to give sort of a snapshot. So where are we today? This is what we look like. Here's our FTE as a system. 84% is on the main campus, 6% is on branches, 10% is other, whether that's distance learning, whether that's an institute, whether it's something else. It's not a branch campus, it's not a main campus. In 5 years from now, which is where the facilities projections are looking at, we're looking at what's the need in 5 years, because it takes 2, 3, 4 years to fund and finish a facility. So we're looking at the need 5 years out. The numbers increase, but the relative percentages stay unchanged. So that's just a little bit of background to show, as currently designed, we're not planning to build a lot more branches or others. Most of our growth is going to occur on the main campus, as currently projected by the universities. Here's the actual projection, and what I wanted to highlight here is the relative size of the institutions. One thing the work group has found is the formula works very well for the main campus need, but it doesn't work as well for the branches. That's mostly a factor of the relative size, and I'll have to include New College in that. The FTE are so much smaller, the projections, it doesn't have the same, it doesn't work as well. And the work group believes we need different factors, or one of the concepts has been, instead of saying factor times FTE equals need, they might say for a given size branch, we want a 1,000 FTE branch, this is the size facility we need. Because the likelihood at a branch is we're going to build one facility and we won't come back for a long time. So we need to build it to meet maybe not 5-year growth, but 10-year growth.
Sorry,
yes.
I don't want to jump ahead of but when you're looking at those factors, is the amount of distance learning participation in the FTE getting factored in now?
Yes, distance learning counts as FTE.
So, but are you adjusting it based on the percentage of participation toward your enrollment from that?
I believe, and I might have to lean towards an academic person from about a distance learning FTE is based on 40 credit hours, and a distance learning credit hour counts the same as a on-campus credit hour. So we don't make any distinction.
I guess I just would say is that number maybe goes up. Obviously, the need for classroom space relative to those bodies is not the same, and some of those other needs, it may become a tweaking factor that you need to look at like a branch campus.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the things we have found looking at is, and I'll get back to you on this, I say most, but it may not be most, a significant portion of distance learners are students on the main campus who are taking one course. So they still need, maybe they don't need one classroom for one semester, but they still need the office space, the study space.
Yeah, no question.
You
But I'm just saying
understand
it starts to factor into that demand side of the equation at some point.
Yes.
Also, Chris, on this current chart that you're showing, I think there should probably be another column in there. You're only looking at the 5-year growth between now and 2013, but realistically, some of the institutions like FIU, UCF, haven't met the projected growth currently, and that's not factored into here in terms of the percentages over on the right. So that in fact there would be greater disparities if you factored in the current lack of space that for the institutions not meeting their projections.
Right.
Yeah, I just think it should show, because otherwise somebody looking at this cursorily may think that certain institutions don't really need that much in terms of capital planning growth, whereas it is actually there's a much larger need.
Okay. So again, Dr. Chase makes an excellent point. Again, the FTE plans of the universities very much drive the need, which is one of the major factors we look at. Going to the next slide, this is the classroom. What it shows, the checkered column shows the system average need met for classroom space. The little yellow rectangles and squares on top, those are the new projects that were approved in that at the board in September. So they just kind of float on top. Current means current existing space or space that was already fully approved by the Board of Governors. And you can see in general terms, we're recommending, and the board has approved space where there's the greatest need. We see a little bit of an exception there for University of Florida. But again, this goes back to some of the comments I made and remarks I made in September. Each facility may have a mixture of the different space types. So we would not want to tell, for example, a university, no, you can't put a classroom in that building because you're over in classroom or you're above the system average. You don't need a classroom. We do allow that. So this is the classroom need, but you can see as a system, we're at 83%. That we're showing a good increase, in 5 years, we'll be better off than the 78% where we currently are. As PICO increases, as we add projects over the next 5 years, we'll be getting closer to 100% of need met. And
That'll
again,
ever happen, Chris?
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go back.
I was away from the microphone. I guess my question is, you said 100%. You think, I'm assuming that will never happen, right? That there will always be some type of unmet need.
That's one of those very difficult philosophical questions. And you would like, as from an efficiency standpoint, you would, in theory, never want to have more than you need. You'd want to have just enough. But you want to have just enough so as a university says, should we offer more classes and we've maxed out utilization, do we have this, the facility would come online just as your enrollment grows. It's hard to, finesse that. You would not, I think most of our university would say, we don't have enough space currently. The only realistic, unfortunately, this is a very good example of how we catch up the way we don't want to catch up. By reducing enrollment, if we reduce enrollment, the facility there's less need for space. If we hold our enrollment flat and keep building things, we'll eventually, have all our need met. But obviously that's not where we want to go as a system. So there's, a balancing act, in a year where it's good for facilities and meeting needs, it's very bad for enrollment. This is the teaching lab statistic, and you can see we're much better off than in classrooms. Not much better. We're 5% better off in teaching lab than in classroom space. And here's the office space. That's it. These slides are not all proportionate. We're a little worse off in office space. And finally, the research lab space. And I will, obviously, University of Florida, South Florida, sort of sticks out there in research lab space. The interdisciplinary science and teaching lab includes a significant amount of research lab space, and that is reflected in the 42%. The next project on their list, not yet funded by our board, but the next on the list also includes a significant amount of research lab space. So as the university requests space in that category, it will increase because they are under in that category.
Just on this one as well, is it the same factor for the allocation, regardless of the orientation of the institution? Like how much research dollars they're bringing in, does that factor into their demand side for research, or is, I'm not asking that question well, but are we looking at how much research they're actually doing as to how much research space they need, or is everyone getting treated the same in the formula?
No, everyone is not treated. It doesn't have the same factor by formula, but it does vary. But it's all within a range of the universities that are doing significant research, and it depends a lot on disciplines. Some disciplines require greater amount of research space by formula than other disciplines. And I think in this case, there just hasn't been as much facilities constructed. Now this only reflects the main campus. So it's possible there's some research space off the main campus.
Well, I don't want to belabor this, but this is a very odd chart to me. If somebody really has only 42% of their research lab space being met, why is there nothing proposed?
Well, currently for that institution, I know we don't have a representative at this point, but that could be, they may want to address that as well. We do have a project in the works, the Interdisciplinary Science and Teaching Lab. We had it funded over 3 years. We've accelerated for 2 years. The next project on the list for the university on the main campus is the Classroom Honors College, which includes a significant amount of research space.
Well, Chris, excuse me, but I think the question would then be, is it, if I understand your question correctly, Governor McDevitt, is why don't we have the proposed part on this graph as it relates to the yellow configuration? Does it need to be updated?
Possibly the proposed is misworded. That's just historic. These have been approved by the Board of Governors for funding. The next project for South Florida has not yet been approved by...
So this includes that interdisciplinary?
It includes interdisciplinary, doesn't include that other project.
Okay.
We don't, if we included, that is sort of a misnomer, because we've included every project for every university, we'd be well over 100% in need, but we don't have funding for it.
But Chris, given USF's Carnegie institution designation, something's really wrong with this figure, and I would suggest that there have to be mitigating circumstances or something that we don't know about that's adding to their research space. Otherwise, there's no way they could be realistically producing the grant totals they are and satisfying the needs of faculty.
I think that, and just let's keep in mind the special configuration, shall we say, of the University of South Florida, and that they have branch campuses and they have other needs that other universities don't have. And I would think, and I would look to Chris and look to Mark to kind of comment on this, I think that that may lead to why this figure or why this particular chart may appear skewed at this point. It's just kind of based upon I guess the particular and special configuration of that university versus the other 10. Is that part of the reason that this looks so different, Chris, or am I totally off base?
I'm not certain. That could well be. What we can certainly do is get back with the university. We'll look at their FTE. We'll look at their factor, and it's possible that in this particular instance for the University of South Florida, because of the different configuration, because of the way they're structured, maybe for this space category, and there's 10 space categories. These are just the top 10. I didn't put in gym and study space and the others. Maybe the factor for them is low, maybe, or it shows higher than it ought. Maybe, as Dr. Chase says, somehow they're doing wonderfully well as in research, and that does seem to be an anomaly.
Is health sciences in this? Is this the whole Tampa campus, or is this the Tampa campus the way they view the Tampa campus and then health sciences? Because that could be another factor for why that one's looking
Well,
that way.
I'm looking in this long list here, and there are a few projects that would add some research space. The one that's got 300 and something, but not a whole lot.
Well, the one other thing I think I would just encourage that we should continue to revisit is as we update our strategic plan, and we've been putting a particular focus on STEM, I think we ought in the proactive mode be looking at our ratios and balance on what we're striving for, because this is expensive space and it probably takes longer to bring on to some degree given how much these projects cost when they're trying to balance what the bang for the buck, so to speak. And I think we ought to kind of continue to watch this, because if we're going to up the output of STEM graduates, our demand for this may change as well versus the historical.
Well, Governor Parker.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I will certainly look into this in greater depth, and I hopefully maybe can provide some interim information to the committee or to the board.
Well, I will say this, and I mean, you may have captured this, but there's a lot of lab space in the College of Marine Sciences that reports to the main campus but isn't on the main campus. So I'm assuming you picked that up?
I'll need to go back and look into those specific details, because you're exactly right. What's construed as part of the main campus varies from each university. I'll look at the specific building mix and see, is there stuff that we would say, well, that is part of the research space, even though it doesn't reflect on the need. And if that's the case, we can do a modified version of this chart, because it ought to reflect as part of their system research space. May I go to the next slide?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. The other portion that I wanted to cover briefly, some of the questions we had, dealt with utilization. And there is a statutory formula for utilization that's very complicated, but it's basically a 40-hour standard. However, the numbers here do not reflect that 40-hour standard. OPAGA had done a report a little over 18 months ago, looking at one of the things it looked at was utilization. It had a whole series of recommendations, and those were, of course, considered by the Facilities Task Force, and I believe we made a commitment to, as much as possible, adopt many of those APAGA recommendations, including utilization was one of the big factors. This is based on the APAGA metrics. So if we look, for example, that first column, the utilization Monday through Friday, that's on a 65-hour-a-week standard. And you can see, as a system, even in the last 2 years, we've made a good improvement. We've improved over 5% in a 2-year period, which, dealing with these very large numbers of classes in a short time frame, is, I believe, very significant. We've increased utilization at our peak period, which is 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Night utilization is slightly down. Utilization on Fridays is up. Utilization on Saturdays, which was very small, has slightly decreased. That's as a system. We will have, this is based on spring '05 to spring '07. In another few weeks, we'll have final data for fall of '07, and we can see, hopefully, how much more utilization has increased. This is that overall utilization on the APAGA measure, again, Monday through Friday for each university. And you can see across the board, since the system has gone up, overall, as a system, most universities have shown good utilization increases. I also wanted to point out, for the record, or for the committee, APAGA looked at spring of '05. We have much greater utilization in the fall. Fall is when we have our peak enrollment, and fall is when we have more courses taken, so that increases utilization. So just for comparison, here's spring of '05 versus fall of '06, and I believe with some of the actions taken by universities to increase utilization, we will again see an increase in utilization in fall of '07. And so I think the other comment I was going to make is we do look at utilization as well as the space formula, and roughly, if you compare it, I don't have that chart, I couldn't quite put it all in one, it got overly complicated. You look at the universities that have high utilization, they'll also be lower in need. I mean, greater in need. They'll be lower on the chart, and vice versa. There is a relationship between the amount of space you have and how you use the space, and so there is a correspondence there. And I can provide more information on that as the committee wishes. And that is the information I have, and I will have a full update in March.
Dr. Rosenberg?
The issue of facilities, bricks and mortar, is an issue that, as long as we have universities, we will be having significant discussions about them. No question that the PICO is a precious resource for us that we should continue to show that we are getting greater efficiency out of the dollars that are allocated to us. As you look at these graphs, there are some policy issues that do present themselves that at some point the board probably should consider. Essentially, we're doing the business the way we're doing on PICO because that's the way we've done it for a while. And so, for instance, the board, as a policy concern from a system viewpoint, might raise the question, at what point is there a threshold that is unacceptable that we should address before we continue to build at another institution, for instance? So at what point is the fact that you might have a greater need at Campus A more important than the need for a new research laboratory at Campus B? At this point, we are not necessarily looking at our business that way, part one. Part two, as our universities become more successful at federally funded sponsored research, we very well could face the dilemma that we are putting too much PICO into research laboratories that could be financed through bonding, and that the research laboratory investment using PICO dollars is not as good of an investment as we could be making if we were putting the PICO dollars into classroom or instructional space. At this point, we don't have a policy on that. I do want to compliment several of our institutions that are beginning to use their facilities and administrative overhead to bond against research facilities rather than using the scarce PICO dollars. So at some point, I think we do have that, if you will, policy crossroads to look at. And then finally, Chris, I worry that we would offer up greater efficiency in terms of utilization in the next few semesters, given that we, as a consequence of the budget cuts, are likely to reduce the number of sections that we're offering. So we might have a greater intensity of utilization, but we may not have a greater utilization, given that we may not, again, by virtue of the budget cuts, be offering as many sections as we would hope to our students. So three issues that we, Madam Chair, would like to come back to you at some point to have a more thorough discussion about.
Madam Chair.
And to add to the Chancellor's remarks, I think it's also important that the trustees have the information that we have, and I would hope that they do, because that PICO list from their university is approved by the trustees. And it's very important that they prioritize the needs appropriately and take all of this into consideration, because there have been occasions when we got a PICO list from a university that maybe, if you were looking at these charts, you wouldn't think was to serve the purpose as needed. So I think this is where you expect your trustees to be very strong and work with the president and the administration to make sure their list is prioritized appropriately.
One thing, just as you continue to develop in what you're looking at, that I think is going to be important as well, is to start to address what's going to be coming in functional obsolescence. Yeah, because my guess is all buildings are treated equal for space if they're occupied at this point in this survey, and they may not have. I mean, that may, as things are changing, and particularly with the LEED and the other things that we're looking at, that issue may also start to come into just another factor that we need to address, because each square foot's not equal, even amongst classroom space and office space and everything else, as far as the productivity that can be generated from it.
I wanted to thank the members of the committee for the comments. I guess one thing I want to ask you, Dr. Rosenberg, given that this is part of the collaborative facilities initiative, the items that you just suggested that are going to be things that we're going to need to consider as a board, are those items that the facilities initiative is actually considering as well, or something that you've thought of, I guess, based upon the information or data you've received today?
Well, the facilities initiative actively isn't considering. These are long-term concerns that we have, and they address more broadly, if you will, system and policy at the higher level than did the facilities initiative directly focus upon.
Okay.
Although the facilities initiative did allude to the fact that maybe more facilities could be bonded. I mean, that's in there.
I guess
which is a bit controversial with the legislature.
It's controversy with the legislature, and for every action there's a reaction. If we would use F&A revenue, facilities and administrative revenue, to cover bond costs, we would be diverting some of that revenue from legitimate infrastructural support needs that it is being used for, and invariably that gap would have to be picked up elsewhere in the university budget. So there's an implication to it. And now some of our institutions have bonded facilities where they've used a mix of bonding and PICO, F&A bonding and PICO and other sources of revenue, Cortellis match or donations to get the facilities done. But in the main, across time, as we grow and as our research portfolio gets larger, we are going to have to be far more creative in finding revenue mixes to underwrite facilities and lab refits, retrofits in order to, if you will, keep up.
And I guess what I want to do is I don't want your comments to kind of go undocumented, and I would like for us to kind of think of a way to go ahead and start at least having this committee start thinking about the items that that you presented to us. Okay. So what I would like to have you do is to maybe go ahead and codify the information that you just presented orally, and then we'll submit it to this committee and let us start thinking about it and think of the best way to address the issue.
Thank you.
I guess, so often, we deal with so many different issues that good ideas go unrecognized and not taken care of. So I didn't want that to happen with what you presented.
Thank you.
I think that another thing I wanted to mention is that the information that you presented here is really good. And I think that, first I want to thank you for taking a moment to pull it together. And also I recognize that this is just a preliminary report, and we'll have a final report, I guess, in our March meeting. Is that correct?
That's our goal.
I agree with the comments from our chair as well as from the chancellor in that it may be beneficial for our boards of trustees to have the information that you have in this report given to them as well. So I'd like for us to think of some mechanism, and I think maybe work with the chancellor in thinking of a way we can make sure that our presidents and our boards have the information presented in this presentation. They can think about, because a lot of times we make decisions in a vacuum and don't stand up and get a chance to really see the impact of how one decision really affects the other. But something about the way you presented it here is a good guide, I think, for universities as they plan ahead and for their boards. So if you would work with the chancellor and think of some way to make sure that we share this information with the boards in the manner in which it's been presented. Okay. And then one final thing I want to mention. On one of the very first items that you presented, whenever we talked about the 2007, I guess, completed facilities project, there's actually a project that was on here from the University of Florida that I thought had a very interesting funding mix that I wanted to, I guess, to mention. And I guess it's from the Pew Hall, where they have Cortellis, FDOT, PICO, and
University of, that's abbreviation, University of Florida funds, other funds. And I think, as the chancellor said, the universities have been very creative in using a mixture of funding. And you'll see that on that list of 16 projects, where a lot of projects aren't pure PICO or pure Cortellis. They're a blend, and maybe they bond some, and maybe they get some other private money that aren't matched for Cortellis but are for the facility. This was a grant from Florida Department of Transportation, and so, and I could get the relative amounts. We have all that, but it does go to say, it takes a mixture of fundings to get these very expensive facilities completed.
And I guess the FDOT was something that I don't commonly see, and I was kind of curious, and I don't know if anyone's here from University of Florida can comment on what it was that actually brought that synergy together, because I think that so much money is put into transportation in the state of Florida. If there are different ways that as our universities grow, if we can partner with FDOT and with our local transportation authorities, it'd be wonderful for us to share the wealth between the universities and the transportation system. So if you would find out for me.
I will look into the specifications on that.
And if that's something that's commonly done, I'd be interested in hearing from the universities on that. I don't recall seeing that.
I think it's fairly unique because I haven't seen it either, but I'll look into it.
Madam Chairman, I just want to point out a way of complementing the universities. If you look at the overall utilization, they're working very hard to increase their utilization, and most of the universities did increase it significantly. And for all the reasons the chancellor explained, it's difficult and may become more difficult, but I do know they're working hard to improve that area.
With that, I want to thank the members of the committee for participating today. I want to thank Chris and his staff for all the work that they put into actually pulling this together, and I also want to thank the university staffs for working with us. We're working very diligently to have information out early enough so that we can work with you to ensure that with the small amount of money that we have, that we can kind of work to meet the specific needs of the university. So what we work to do is try to get proposed lists out to you as early as we can, so we can work with your needed problems or concerns as much as within our power and within our guidelines, that we can kind of make sure we're meeting the needs of the university. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Madam Chair, and I know that you're going to officially thank the President for having us here, but I certainly want to thank him for allowing us to convene our Facilities Committee here this afternoon. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Not
again.
only officially thank us tomorrow, but welcome us, so we'll look forward to that. But I've already thanked him personally and publicly tomorrow. To remind you, tonight at the Governor's Mansion, the Presidents and the Board of Governors are invited, and we very much appreciate that. So I look forward to seeing you there and first thing in the morning. If anyone needs a ride in the morning from 7:30 forward, there will be transportation available. Thank all of you, and I look forward to seeing you either this evening or in the morning. Thank you.
How you doing, man?